Welcome to History's Influence. In the 8th century, the ever-expanding Muslim Caliphate had conquered Iberia, previously the home of the Christian Visigothic kingdom. At the Battle of Covadonga, remnants of Visigoth leadership alongside local allies had defeated a Muslim force, and afterwards established the Kingdom of Asturias. The Reconquista had begun, in which the often disunited Christian kingdoms reconquered Iberia from the Muslims. By 1469, the marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon had united Spain, and by 1492, the two Catholic monarchs had conquered the final remnant of Muslim rule in Iberia, the Emirate of Granada. Later, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand's daughter, Joanna the Mad, had married to a Hapsburg and also gave birth to one, with her son Charles V later leading Spain as part of his large European dominion, impacting Spanish history significantly. Habsburg leadership, whilst during Spain's era as the dominant global power, would prove damaging in many regards and would leave Spain in a damaged state. Spain would later lose its status and become a second-grade power, being humiliated and outmatched by the other colonial powers and their previous colonies, followed by periods of further political instability. But what if the Habsburgs never ruled Spain? What would the impacts be if the powerful European royal house never got their distinct jawlines upon the Spanish throne? Would Spain benefit without their leadership? Let's find out. To get this timeline to work, we are going to need to prevent Charles V from ruling Spain. The most effective way to get Charles away from the Spanish throne is to find ourselves a legitimate heir from the House of Trastamara, the previous ruling house of Spain. The best person suited for this role was the son and rightful heir of Isabella and Ferdinand in our timeline, John, Prince of Asturias. He died at the age of 19, most likely of tuberculosis, although according to rumours he had actually died from overexertion in the bedroom. In either case, we are going to prevent John from catching tuberculosis and hope he learns some restraint in his private life. John will take the thrones of Castile and Aragon as King John III once his parents would come to pass, which would be in 1504 and 1516. This would prevent his older sister, Joanna the Mad, from taking power in Castile, meaning her child Charles V will not take the throne for himself if the new King John can father an heir. We will assume he does father an heir. Other political marriages causing personal unions could occur later in this timeline, but for the sake of simplicity, let's assume this does not happen to Spain, or if it does, it is short-lasting. Let's see what John would inherit, and how it would differ from what Charles V received in our timeline. As mentioned before, he would indeed inherit Castile and Aragon. This would include their territories in Iberia and southern Italy. Charles V would assume control of the other territories and titles, just like in our timeline. Milan was a contested duchy, but Charles V had assumed control using his position as Holy Roman Emperor when fighting against France, not King of Castile or Aragon. If Spain chooses not to assist Charles V in this situation, this may tip the balance in France's favour, leading to a French-controlled Milan. To maintain a balance of power, this control may be revoked later by other nations competing against France. Charles also still holds royal Spanish ancestry and is related to John, so Charles V and John III would likely align with each other in a political sense. Charles V's ambition will likely be smaller in this timeline, but this different relationship between the Habsburgs and Spain would still act as a strong defence against the French. This would help Spain in the long term. Charles V is often regarded as a competent ruler, but Charles striving towards the unification of Europe through a universal monarchy had bankrupted Spain. Even with the immense riches of the American colonies, he still managed to bankrupt the empire. This means Spain was not able to spend this revenue on more fruitful endeavours. The Spanish had also continued to fight expensive wars in mainland Europe after his reign, primarily caused by Charles granting the Netherlands to the Spanish after his abdication. A wealthier Spain would emerge as a result. The revolt of the Comuneros, a Castilian uprising against Charles, would not happen in this timeline. The revolt occurred for multiple reasons. The political instability in Castile coming from Queen Isabella's death was one, and having a mentally stable heir instead of Joanna the Mad like in our timeline would aid this issue. Charles's lavish spending definitely didn't help. A more debatable reason is Charles's non-Castilian upbringing and his overall disconnect to Castilian culture. It is hard to predict how John would fare as a Spanish leader, since there is not that much evidence of his character, but I do not think that his competencies would affect the larger events of Spanish history. The main example would be the conquest of the Americas still occurring. The voyage of Columbus had already happened at this point, and the Castilian endeavours of conquering the Aztecs and Incans would still go ahead, as the Spanish crown had not influenced these events greatly, and I do not see a valid reason for King John or his successors to be opposed to these invasions. Latin America would still be Hispanicized, and the Philippines would still also come under Spanish control, but it wouldn't be named after the Hapsburg King Philip, of course. I do not see any reason to believe the Spanish would expand their colonial empire further, especially given the extractive Spanish colonial model. The Treaty of Tordesillas would restrict their expansion into the Old World, and like in our timeline, they did not feel the incentive to colonize the rest of the Americas. Other Spanish-controlled regions, such as southern Italy and the African colonies, will likely be richer areas as well. The Spanish, just like in our timeline, will become filthy rich from these conquests. Hyperinflation would likely still occur for Spain in this timeline. The influx of gold and silver from the New World was immense, and the Hapsburgs were not the only ones responsible for the mismanagement of the wealth. In any case, without the heavier focus upon the Dutch and Milanese possessions, I do not expect Spain to squander as much of its wealth trying to maintain these regions, or to conquer more of Europe. Revenue from the New World may be used for reinvestment into their colonies, but considering the extractive nature of Spanish colonialism, this is unlikely to cause Latin America or the Philippines to become wealthy regions. The areas would instead be moderately richer. Slavery in areas such as the Caribbean would still occur, with cash crops such as sugar still existing. It is important to remember that the Habsburgs did not dictate these colonial policies, or to be more accurate, they were not the only factor deciding these policies. Portugal had held close royal ties with Spain. The two had unified under the Iberian Union in our timeline for nearly 60 years. This would likely occur in some form or another in this timeline, with a different royal marriage, not a Habsburg one. And if the Spanish needed to fight for the Portuguese throne, the newfound fortune would aid them greatly. However, the Spanish would not have the same vested interest in maintaining the Indian Ocean outposts as the Portuguese did, and would struggle to defend colonies without a Spanish presence within the regions in the first place, which did simply not exist. I do not believe that even with a stronger Spain, that Portugal would remain under the Iberian Union. The other European powers would not have wanted Spain to maintain Portugal and its colonies. They would have likely interfered eventually in favour of Portuguese independence. The English and Portuguese would have still held close relations. Spain in the long term would struggle to maintain the colonies of the Portuguese as previously mentioned. I can see Portugal becoming very disillusioned by this. There is also their sense of identity that had not previously been subjugated by the Spanish. The union would probably last longer, but in the long term, I do not see it making much of a difference in the relations between the two nations. On the topic of Iberian unity, I do not see Andorra becoming part of Spain, mainly due to their French royal ties. The capital of Madrid would still be established. It became the de facto capital during the rule of Habsburg Philip II in the 1500s. This was to further centralise Spain, and I see no reason the Spanish would not centralise in this timeline. The Spanish Armada would not have been created. The Spanish would not have had the same incentives to invade England. They would have not cared about English interference in the Netherlands. The Dutch revolt against the Spanish would have never happened, as there would be no Spanish to revolt against. They would instead rebel against the Habsburgs in Austria, and with fewer resources, the Austrians would not be able to maintain control of the Netherlands. Without the high spending of the Spanish, the Netherlands would not wish to be independent of Austria, but there are other factors to consider, such as the later religious differences and a desire for autonomy. This is not to mention that the Austrians may have been high spenders as well. They were originally led by Charles V in this timeline, not to mention they would want to keep the Holy Roman Empire together. The incredibly brutal religious wars between Catholicism and Protestantism would impact Spain a little differently in this timeline. The wars themselves would still occur, and so would the often contradictory positions of the participants. Because of the close ties to Austria that Spain held, and Spain's staunch Catholicism still being present in this timeline, they would still side with the Catholics for these conflicts, primarily in the 30 Years' War. Spain would not have to contend for regions such as the Netherlands and Milan in the war. For example, the Dutch revolt was a major issue during the 30 Years' War. Therefore, we would expect to see similar outcomes from these conflicts, but with less of a leadership role assumed by the Spanish, meaning their losses would not have been as significant, further strengthening Spain to a moderate extent. North Africa would have been a focal point for the Spanish, thanks to their lowered focus upon Europe. In our timeline, Spain had conquered key regions on the North African coast, but in this new timeline, Spain would be able to hold a more prominent position in the region. Conflict with the Ottoman Empire would still occur, but the overstretched Ottoman navy would not be able to compete with the Spanish in the Western Mediterranean in the long term. No offense to Barbarossa, of course. I do not see much incentive for Spaniards to immigrate to the area. The New World would be a more appealing region for immigration. Given the Spanish's inquisitorial approach, religious conversion is quite likely, especially given the region's proximity to mainland Spain. However, counterexamples of this behaviour do exist. Take the Bangsamoro region in the Philippines, for example, which was never converted away from Islam by the Spanish. Colonial competition against the British, French, Dutch, etc. would still weaken the status of Spain as a superpower. Spain's colonial model was not as effective as the other powers, and with Spanish immigration still being relatively low because of issues such as the caste system in the colonies, I believe the Spanish would not be able to expand their colonial dominion more than they did in our timeline. The same would apply to Portugal. The War of the Spanish Succession would have never occurred. A thoroughly inbred Hapsburg leader would have not left the Spanish throne idle. This would mean the House of Bourbon would have not had taken the Spanish throne, preventing the Bourbon reforms from occurring later in the 18th century. These reforms formally united Castile and Aragon and pushed for centralization and economic reform. These reforms would have likely occurred in some other fashion. Perhaps the Spanish would be indirectly inspired by French absolutism. It could also be argued that Spain would be formally united sooner, given the lower emphasis of a pan-European empire in this timeline. Without the Habsburg focus upon mainland Europe, Spain may begin to reflect upon itself, unifying more as a nation, and not remaining a union of kingdoms with separate laws and such. In the long term, secessionist movements in regions such as Catalonia and Galicia will not be as much of an issue for Spain. I do not see differences being completely removed, but for example, we would see a Castilian dialect of Spanish being more prevalent in these regions. The impact of Napoleon, or a French equivalent, would still be felt in this timeline. This is because I do not see the centralization of France and other socio-economic issues in the country changing much with a stronger Spain. Without the French Bourbon dynasty, the Spanish may be less willing to ally Napoleon. Factors such as the nature of shifting alliances at the time, or a stronger Spain, makes this even less likely. Therefore, Spain will not be allying Napoleon, and this would likely lead to a French invasion. I'm unsure the French would be able to conquer all of Spain swiftly, but they would likely militarily trounce them in classic Napoleon style. Although with different leadership, this may not be the case. In the long run, this would not harm Spain as much as the brutal Peninsular War had, but it would damage Spain nonetheless. Perhaps in this timeline, it would mark the transition point of Spain from a superpower to a moderate power. The Latin Wars of Independence would still happen as a result, but they may occur a little later with a stronger Spain. This delayed independence of Mexico would be unlikely to affect the Mexican-American War or the integration of Texas into the American Union. Even with a moderately more affluent Mexico, similar internal issues within Mexico would still exist, and the United States would still be able to exert control of these areas. The Spanish-American War would likely still occur, causing Spain to lose its colonies in the Americas and the Philippines. The Carlist Wars of the 19th century involved political divisions stemming from two contrasting ideas of how Spain should be ruled, either an authoritarian approach or a more progressive approach. The origins of the First Carlist War were found in the succession of Spain following the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. With different royal houses and no Napoleonic rule of Spain, this exact situation would not occur, but I believe these conflicts of interest would still be an issue. I think a more peaceful transition to democracy would occur, like in other European countries of the time. Spain would still industrialise, but with the prominence and unique societal structure of Great Britain still being factors in this timeline, I would expect the British to industrialise first, and the Spanish to industrialise similarly as to in our own timeline. The scramble for Africa will see Spain hold a more dominant position on the continent, given their more embedded presence in North Africa, much to the dismay of the French. We would see borders along the lines of this map. These colonial acquisitions would not boost Spanish power significantly. There was not much economic benefit from these regions to be gained. Spain would still remain a second-rate power, but not quite as irrelevant as in our timeline. World War I and II did not concern Spain as much as it did the other continental powers, although considering their larger level of influence in this timeline, they may indeed choose to intervene in both world wars, but with a more sidelined approach. With Spain not being as stagnant as in our timeline, and with the Carlist Wars not happening, the Spanish Civil War will not happen. Spain in the modern day would be moderately well off, a common theme throughout this video. The The Spanish economic miracle would likely occur a little earlier if there is no fascist leadership, alongside the rest of Europe. Spain would hold more national unity, and recent issues, such as the Catalonian independence movement, would not be as relevant in this timeline. I do not see Spain holding much geopolitical influence, especially considering the large conflict between the US and Soviet Union instead of the European powers after World War II. For example, the Spanish would not be landing a position at the UN Security Council. Spain would not have too much of an impact in this era. I will leave the timeline there. The Hapsburgs had impeded the Spanish. Their focus upon the domination and unification of Europe had used up the resources and power of Spain, but ultimately, much of Spain's downfall as a superpower was due to how Spanish society and its colonial empire were organized. Most of these problems have roots from before Habsburg rule. They were shaped by factors such as the Reconquista and the unique situation of Castile and Aragon, Castile in particular. Even with less revenue being spent on unfruitful endeavours in Europe, Spain would still eventually decline in comparison to the competing colonial powers in later periods. Looking upon the decline of Spain, I would argue the main issue Spain had was itself. But, like I've been mentioning throughout this video, I believe the Habsburgs had a significant impact upon the nation, being mostly negative. This has been History's Influence. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe, alongside hitting the notification bell. I know it's been a long 5 months since my first upload, but now I've decided to stick with this channel and to produce more consistent content, probably every fortnight or so. It was more of a general feeling I had after uploading the first video that held me back, a fear of criticism I suppose, even if I received a positive reception anyway, but in any case, feel free to mention other alternate histories you would like to see covered in the comments below. Catch you later.